recap what each room talked about, and then do any final questions and that sort of thing. If you do have questions for the panelists, the best way to do those is probably either to drop them in the chat during the roundtables or during that final portion. You can drop them in the chat during this initial portion, but we can't promise that we're going to catch them or be able to ask them, because I think there's probably going to be a lot going on. Yeah. But if you do have questions or technical things, go ahead and drop that in the chat. We do have people monitoring for troubleshooting and that sort of thing as well. So don't be afraid to do that. Otherwise, please stay on mute, especially during this first portion, unless you are one of the panelists. And so I'm going to introduce them. First, we have Ruth Evelyn. Ruth, if you could wave, there we go. Ruth lives in Boston, Massachusetts, and leads and follows equally. Next, we have Katrina Rogers. Katrina uses she, her pronouns, lives in Denver, Colorado, and is a primary follow. Then we have Dan Legenthal. Dan uses he, they pronouns, lives in Boston, Massachusetts, and is a primary lead. And finally, we have Gray Armstrong. Gray is based in Huntsville, Alabama, uses he, him pronouns, and is a primary follow. Oh, great, we have them all pinned up. Thank you, Genevieve. All right, and so with that, I'm going to get us started with kind of the most basic of questions. And I've gotten this question actually multiple times in the planning process. What is the definition of the lead-follow gap? Panelists, I know you all have opinions on this.
I think we're all like rushing to not be the first person to break the silence.
Well, Dan, it's on you now.
So in the interest of keeping it succinct, like, I think most people speak about the skill gap, the technical ability as both a leader and as a dancer. And in general, it seems like leads are either less high up on that scale or develop more slowly as compared with follows.
The only thing that I would add to that is I think sometimes people also talk about that in terms of numbers, that there are also many more high-level followers than there are leaders at any given point.
Cool. All right. Thanks, y'all. I'm going to
strong dissent from our panelists.
Well, we'll get to that, I'm sure. But we're going to, so that's our basic definition. I know that was in the description, but I know other nuances of this definition are going to come up for folks watching if this is a new topic for you. So just hang in there. So jumping kind of right into the thick of it, how does the definition of the lead-follow gap change when we consider Black values, and how does whiteness impact this, how we understand the gap?
Fine, I'll shoot. So I think that's kind of a complicated question. And I think it has to do with, in part, some history of the scene. So if we go back a few years, people were teaching only to leaders and primarily move-based classes. And they mostly ignored followers. And this became a problem in time. And so then events like Blues Muse and other classes started kind of shifting more towards focusing on follower expression, giving follows space. I have strong feelings about that. And started really being more expression and follow focused, rather than being like technical moves, like this is how you do this movement. And for me, as I look at it, I see that as a reflection of some gendered things that exist in white culture, in terms of like the lead is the stand-in for the man, and the follow is the stand-in for the woman. And so you have to give the woman space to be expressive. And in some ways, I think there's been a bit of an overcorrection in terms of we've focused so exclusively on follows at this point that I think we've kind of left the leads behind in terms of some of the class structures and some of the things that are taught. Whereas in Black culture, the gender norms are more so equal. There's not that kind of basic assumption about the power dynamic that exists there. And so you learn to dance yourself first, and then you participate in your role as an equal partnership. So for instance, like the giving space idea doesn't really function under that norm. And I think in that way, we've kind of created a system where we have in some ways prioritized the education of followers in very like intentional, expressive, beautiful ways to kind of negate the white gender norms that happen. But in that same time, we've also kind of gotten, oh, that's not me. I'm not a non-panelist. Sorry, I saw the chat. But in some ways, we've kind of gotten away from addressing leaders specifically and having classes focused on them, and also learning how to have a class that is movement-based or a Muse-based class that equalizes the participants. So a Muse-based class doesn't have to be just lead focused or only follow expression focused. Like, I think there's an overall structural problem that shows up because of the cultural norms that exist. I will deal with that while someone else talks.
So I was thinking, like, adding on to what Gray had said about sort of the power dynamics that are at play, there is, when you have coming into Black space and having a Black dance, there is an expectation that each person is owning their own movements and they're owning their own expression within the dance, and that you are dancing already. And so each person within this partnership are already dancing their own way. And then as you come into partnership, you are starting to figure out how does that blend into each other. And so, you know, oftentimes we do hear of it as a conversation where, you know, each two are contributing equally what their expression, their wants, how are they are hearing the music. And if we're pulling outside of that into relationship dynamics outside of Blackness and going into whiteness, there's sort of like, and in traditional, I don't want to say traditional, in the way that we have often been raised in terms of gender norms, that this is what the man does and this is what the woman does, this is what a leader does, this is what a follow does, starting to break down that and understanding that the lead isn't dictating to the follow, right? And the follow isn't just there to like listen and do whatever. And so as what Gray was saying, we're starting to kind of correct that and say, no, each person has a voice, which then pulls it back into Black values of an expectation that you each show up with what you're bringing to the table into that dance. And that's really important to understand. Like, as we're starting to look at the nuances of all the different things, as we're talking about whiteness, as we're talking about Blackness, as we're talking about gender, you know, now we're starting to pull in a lot more that really comes into play. Is when I decide to be a follow, even my own journey was probably initially when I was in there, I identify as a female, therefore I'm a follow. But then as I started to dive into it and even touch back into my own Blackness and realizing that I have a voice and I'm just going to show up in the ways that I always have, and really owning that really shifted as to me identifying myself as a follow is this is the role that I choose because it makes the most sense for me. Not even an absence of leading. When I lead, I just take on what am I supposed to do in this role that's in addition to my own personal expression. And so I think as we start to like identify that and understand that you do have to bring yourself to the table regardless of the role is really important. I think that will start to like shift our skill sets as we move forward. At least that's the hope.
I think I would, I agree with what Gray and Katrina were saying with this, and I would add, I guess I don't really feel like I can speak specifically from a white cultural lens because I'm Jewish, and that is a slightly different dynamic than I would say what traditional white cultural perspectives are. But one of the things that I do see is that many students come into the dance expecting to be a leader and to be a follower rather than being a dancer. And I think that that is one of the things that I hear kind of underlying the things that you're saying. And that is one of the things that I think when we start thinking about leaders, and again, these expectations of you're male, so, or you're perceived as male even, so you're shunted into, now you're going to lead, and you're female or perceived as female, oh, you're following, to the extent that when I have students who I see in class, like if there's somebody who's like, hey, you know, I'm male and I really want to follow, they get a lot of implicit or even explicit pressure from other students. No, like there aren't enough leads, so you have to lead, which is, wow, that's a lot. And so I think that having that assumption, and then a lot of the people who are following, who are coming from a lot more background of movement or being a dancer. So then suddenly people who are leading are stuck with like, wait, I have to do what? I have to dance and lead? Could I just stick with one? I'll just lead some stuff. So.
I think there's, Gray, do you want to test the microphone? Nope. I think there's another aspect of like differences in culture that I think is really key here. God, I struggle so hard not to be verbose. So the thing that I want to get to is like a lot of white America is uncomfortable with bodies. And I mean that in a very general sense. Like if you're a straight white man in Ohio and you go out to a bar, like you're not dancing. It's not happening. Whereas with Hispanic and from my experience of Black culture, Black American culture, like dancing is just a thing that happens. You don't have to be good at it, but you also don't feel ashamed of not being good at it, if that makes sense. Whereas I think one of the big issues is like a lot of like unlearning has to happen before like one can get comfortable moving themselves, even you know, as a beginner, like knowing that it's not going to be good and just being okay with it. And while, you know, I don't want to blame everything on that, I think it's an important reason why like our predominantly like white scene like has trouble getting male-bodied people to like just get comfortable. Oh, which is to say, sorry, should probably link this, which is to say they start focusing on like, okay, I'm going to lead things rather than like, I'm going to dance.
Yeah, it's easy to kind of stay in the idea of just the technical aspect of moving, and then when you come in and start talking about feel the music and allow the music to dictate how you move, and there's a disconnect. And I know for myself, when people ask me, well, when did you learn to dance, or how long have you been dancing? And it's a very awkward question for me, because I've always been dancing. As long as there was music, I moved my body to it. And I didn't know moves or what it was. So, you know, having to be an instructor now and sort of like identify a specific thing, or like fishtails or that, I was like, oh, what is that? If you were to ask me, I don't know, but if you were to show me, you're like, oh yeah, I've been doing that, this, and the other, and whatever. But learning, actually teaching people to feel themselves, and Dan, you're hitting it, is that a lot of people don't have a relationship with their bodies, and understanding that their bodies are meant to move, and that it can move, and that it doesn't mean a certain thing,
Yeah.
i.e. sexuality, or that you're coming on to somebody if you move like your hips. And if you move your hips in a certain way, that your body is just your body, and it can move because that's what's happening in the music. And so when we understand that certain cultures, you know, say, oh, you can't move your body, and if you're only moving your body this way, it must mean X. And so you're taking all of these values or learned behaviors, and then we're saying, no, it's okay here, but you have to undo that. And so whatever your background, you know, there's a lot of times when if we're not even having the same conversation of what it means based on your upbringing, then we're going to have a little disconnect. Like Dan said, we're going to have to undo, and even Gray said this, there's a lot that has to happen sometimes before we can even talk about movement, and not, would be very careful that I'm teaching you a movement because I want to break it down so you understand how to do something, that then we have to bring it back and understand that that's dancing, right? So if I turn on a song and I've been in class and okay, everybody dance, and everybody looks at me like, this is a beginner class and you're here to teach me how to do this thing. And I'm like, just listen to the music, move in the way that makes sense to you, and then I will help you figure out this thing, as compared to I'm doing the thing. No, dance. Dance is not doing, dance is dance.
Am I doing it right?
I don't know, are you?
Yeah, I think that people, I've been talking to some friends, and one of my friends was saying that when he teaches people who grew up in white culture, as a Black man, he's like, you have to stop worrying so much about whether you look good or not. You just have to like stop trying to make the shapes, let it happen.
All right, we have a bit of a breather. Gray, do you want to test your sound again?
How's that? Does that work?
You can hear
Okay,
you.
good. Wonderful. Like most dance events, there are people in the house and people are having a good time. But they're in the other room. And so I had to find headphones, and I wasn't expecting Kenny's here. You know, let's just say it that way. So one thing, like I know we're probably about to switch topics, but one thing I think is important to note here also is this idea of like, when I teach people that grew up in white culture that are specifically socialized as male, they often struggle with kind of like Katrina was saying about being okay with being feeling silly, but also there's this expectation that they should know what they're doing and should be able to show their partner a good time. And I understand in some ways where that comes from. And at the same time, that is probably one of the biggest factors that stop people socialized as a male from progressing, is because with that mindset, it's always about, specifically when they're leaders or they haven't spent a lot of time doing both roles, it causes them to stop thinking not about themselves. They're always thinking about themselves as a utility, and as a way to, the way to be a good dancer is to show your partner a good time and to make them look good. It's never about them as an individual. And I think that in a lot of ways that causes people to not even really address themselves. And I run into a lot of issues with that population where I'll say, okay, we're going to do this movement. And they're like, I don't know how to move my hips. And I'm like, actually you do. And they're like, what do you mean? I was like, well, of course you do. You've been walking for how long, or you've been moving for how long, or whatever that is. And everyone has a sense of rhythm. Everyone has these things, and it might just be that you've repressed them, or you haven't practiced them, or you've been always so focused on your partner that you haven't even looked at yourself and your own skill level. And so for me as an instructor, one of the things that I really focus on is trying to not only raise that awareness, but challenge them to basically get fine motor skills when it comes to like some of these things. And like the only way to do it is to practice it. And I think that when in classes where it's more focused on expression, it's harder to kind of gain that skill.
I kind of want to add to that. I also find that in classes, we still have an expectation of leaders being able to lead something that they are literally learning in that class, and that there's not any real leeway of learning how to navigate how to learn together in partnership in a class. So I can understand, you know, if I was starting off leading, how that can be very daunting as well. Being like, I don't know my body. I'm now attached to somebody else. And now the person that I'm attached to has an expectation that I can lead this move well, so that my partner can practice the thing, you know, over me, instead of, hey, okay, this is what the teacher said for the leads, this is what the follow says, but how do we actually learn to do that together? And I feel like there's not a lot of room being afforded to the leaders to also be learning in that space. And I think, you know, kind of all the things that we say, we really kind of see it in that space of that expectation of how we see leaders, that they can't falter, they can't then. And so it's, or I'm going to be good enough to like get it through so you can kind of do the thing, but there's not any room for me to really practice, you know, my skill level, because I'm focused on this other person and meeting their needs over my needs.
Yeah, that's a lot. Before we move on, there's like so many ways we could go. One thing that I'm picking up on that I think might be confusing to some people listening is that we've mentioned gender a lot, but we haven't really kind of defined gender and the gender binary and how that differs between whiteness and blackness. And so I was wondering if we could talk about that a little bit, just sort of to bring us all on the same page, since that is playing into this conversation.
All right. That's a big topic, and not everyone agrees on a lot of different things, but essentially your gender depends on a lot of different, like there's a lot of different philosophies behind gender and what it means and how it shows up and where it comes from and yada 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 yada. But basically there are ideas and different structures to how people view gender. And gender is in some ways an assumption of what interests and styles and roles and participation in society you're going to take on. And that may have things tied to your body, that may have in certain systems, that may have things not tied to your body in other systems. And that's gender. And so I'll say, I guess, traditional white binary system of gender, you have the men and you have the women as a concept. And lately, in particular, there has been more awareness around an alternative system that has existed for ages and has existed in variations throughout many cultures throughout the world for ages, of there being an existence of genders that are not in those two categories, that exist in between and exist elsewhere and exist not at all. And so that's one system, or those are two different systems that are taking place in white culture. For me personally, how I understand the traditional Black gender system is that it's a little bit different. You're not as, okay, wait, to back up slightly. The traditional white gender norm system is also based around your body. There's kind of this assumption that your body equals your gender. In the Black traditional system, and what I've kind of researched and gathered and like experienced my personal self, it's not so much about your body, but it's more about what role you decide to play in society. If you are, I view Black culture as a matriarchy, not a patriarchy, which is another divergent thing that like plays into this whole situation. But I think like, because there is this different structure that is, even from there, it's a very different system in terms of like, are you going to be the like hosting personality? Are you the one who like manages shit? Are you that person? That's the Black woman role, or the Black, like, and there's not a word for that because it's not really how you think about it. Like, you start getting into weird areas there, but that's kind of that role. And in that role, you can exist in terms of how you participate in society, and your style and your values and all those things exists on a spectrum. So in that spectrum, you could have a very butch Black woman and a very high feminine Black woman who both agree that they're Black women, and everyone also sees them as Black women. You also could have someone who was, bodies are hard, born with a male body, who decides to participate in our society in that role, and they just get accepted into that. And the reverse is true. So an easy example is like, our hair spaces are very gendered. So if you are a man, you go to the barbershop. If you're a woman, you go to the beauty shop. But there are people of all body types, of all backgrounds, that sometimes go to opposite ones, because that's whatever, it fits more with whatever role or like social group that they're a part of. And they're welcome and accepted. It's only weird when you're in the opposite, like, overarching category, that you go to the other one, then it changes the space. Like, I'm trans guy. As a kid, when I was a little girl, I would go to the barbershop to like pick up a brother or like an uncle or whatever, and everything would get really formal. They would get very polite, because that's how you treat the opposite space. But if I were to go now, or I spend time with Black men now, I see a very different version of that space, because I'm accepted, even though like my body may not match their bodies, some of their bodies. So that's how I organize that thought. It's a big topic. I hope that clarified some things or gave you a structure to work with. Not everyone agrees on these structures. I know also that in Black culture, there is trying to be more celebration of that, of the more extreme ends of the spectrum, in terms of like people who cross over or want to kind of exist in between the two boxes. But I also feel like Black culture is a little slower in terms of like these types of changes. So although it's happening, definitely happening, because our structure was already more open-ended, it's like gonna take a little while before we get the same amount of like vibrant, visible change. Okay, bye.
That was really great. Thank you, Gray, for going through that for us. And I'm sure, as you know, the folks listening can understand how like that structure is very different than the white structure, and like how all of that may have a lot of conflict when it comes to then how we're relating to dancing, and incorporating these other aspects of culture and gender into our dancing. So we just have a couple minutes left, and I think we'll probably get into those more in our roundtables. But does anyone have any comments they want to make related to what Gray said, or kind of how this all ties in? Gray, you said it all. All right, well then I'm going to keep us on time. So now we're going to go into 2 roundtables. So we're going to have a lead roundtable and a follow roundtable. And what really that means is that each of those conversations is going to be focused on kind of leading and focused on following, not necessarily that like everyone participating only leads or only follows or only, and like you can't attend whichever one you want to. The follow roundtable is actually going to stay in this call. So if you want to hear that conversation, you just stay right here. The lead roundtable is going to have to go into a different call. Genevieve has just posted that into the chat, and I believe it's also on the website for folks if you want to find it there. That Zoom link is also there. So we're going to take about a 10-minute break to allow for that transition. You know, if you need to go grab some refreshments, use the bathroom, whatever, this is your chance to do that. And then when we come back, we'll talk about this a little bit more. Panelists, you're welcome to turn off your cameras for the time being if you would like.